It's better than Corey's mental hospital thingy. Jesus.
I don't know. It's a little post-apocalyptic.
Well, then that's perfect, isn't it?
It is. That's a good segue into movie talk. And it's just movie talk. Now, unfortunately, my brother
got lost in Uganda somewhere.
Got lost in Uganda as he was coming across the border, so he won't be joining us. Which is unfortunate, but it makes room for other people such as yourself to come on Movie Talk. And today we're going to review... What are we reviewing today, Heather?
Ever Since the World Ended.
What can you tell us about Ever Since the World Ended? The film which we are reviewing today.
Well, it's a movie that we've actually seen before. I'm sort of a, shall we say, connoisseur of the apocalyptic movie genre. Sort of, kind of. I watch really bad movies, as Marty would say.
If you have a list of movies, you'll shoot right for the bottom.
It's like, amazing. I don't even know how it happens at this point. It just happens.
You're like Eagle Soar, but you're like one of those fish hunting birds, right? You just dive in the water, and you're designed so you just shoot right down to the bottom.
Yeah. Okay, so I came across this movie in my glorious sort of just typing in apocalypse and all that kind of stuff. However, the first time we saw it, we were both, as I recall, pretty impressed with it. It was shot in San Francisco, so Bay Area, yay. Probably for very, very little money.
We should say that's the home of the studios of Movie Talk.
What? Oh, the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Okay. So we decided that as part of our various genre review, I don't know if this falls under the sweet but missed, but it's our apocalypse movie review or something.
Okay. And what's the movie about?
So, two guys, 12 years after a plague happens, it sounds like worldwide, they decide to do a movie. They find a video camera and manage to get it powered and decide to do a movie where they go around and interview people living in San Francisco. At that point, it's 186 in San Francisco. There's some suggestion that there's some communities roughly kind of in Marin and maybe even further up in Mendocino, but very, very loose communities, I guess you'd say.
Because there's so few people left.
There's so few people left, right? Although I just got to point out that ecological principles will always say that 10% would survive a plague, and so it's sort of suggesting that you did have survivors. They don't know why, but, like no genetic particular reason why, but so yeah, it's about them going around and interviewing people who remembered the old world, as they call it, and newer kids, I guess, teenagers who were very young at the time it happened, who are now kind of grew up with that trauma, and kind of the different communities, especially San Francisco being all hippy-dippy, kind of sort of intentional communities, and the various kind of brokenness that came out of that trauma.
So it's a pseudo-documentary or a mock documentary?
Mockumentary, I think they're called, yeah. Yes, it's, handheld camera style. And I liked it both times, I have to say. Kind of what I really appreciate about this movie is that even though there are some broken people and there are people still shooting at people, we haven't all turned into ravening cannibals or crazed warlords that you see in a lot of the apocalypse movies. It's kind of like, oh, right, there's still humanness and there's still community and there's still connection. Granted, a great deal of sadness and melancholy in that realm, but that it's not all of this sort of like crazed, Mad Max style. kind of apocalypse. So I kind of appreciate that movie for that because they're pretty rare that has a somewhat positive look. I mean, again, super melancholy. Spoilers, right? Go see the movie. Ever Since the World Ended, it's an awesome movie, but we're gonna be spoiling it all to death, so just go watch it. Turn off now and go watch. Come back later. I just want to say that because I don't want to disappoint people.
People need to learn to work with disappointment, Heather. And if we can offer just a little bit of that in a world saturated disappointment, I think that's a valuable service that Movie Talk can offer.
Really?
Really?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And we're a movie review, so I don't want to see a movie review for a movie I haven't seen yet.
Well,
If they're going to tell me every single damn thing that happened in the movie, which we will do.
well, Miss Burns, who taught us AP English, always said there's no secrets in great literature. So, if people think there are, then they haven't listened to Mrs. Burns.
Okay. Anyway.
Yeah, I think it did. I didn't like it quite as much as the first time because for some reason the melancholic element stuck out to me the first time, and this time the slightly hokey kind of conventions stood out. Like the dangerous hinterlands where the guy got shot, the having to deal with the wounded tribe member and the young boy who shoots the guy, and there was the acting was well anyway. So it's those elements.
Acting.
Those elements stuck out a little more, and the drama felt a little contrived, and it felt a little counter purpose because the movie itself, the trope being a documentary and a sort of slice of life presentation, seems like it shouldn't. It would have been more powerful if it just dealt with daily life stuff, and so the little punctuate, the killing of the someone in the community who kills off the dangerous guy Mark. It just seemed like those were a little unnecessary, and diluted the theme, and well, not the theme so much as the tone, the tone being that. Really, I thought the most potent part of the film was the presentation of healing from trauma and the melancholy that has no solution. When they have no explanation for why they survived. There's no heroic reason for the plague. It's just
Shit happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's no meaning to it, and yet I think where they got it right was in presenting the tonality of living living in uncontrollable and unknowable circumstances, and still having to find a way not to surrender to the void and to the ravages of meaninglessness, and that seemed to be the heart of the film, and the little dramatic punctuation seemed. I mean, I can kind of forgive them, but they seemed a little contrived this time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Kind of again, I think overall, one amazing how they managed to get these shots of San Francisco with like no cars, unless they manipulated it. But I mean,
No,
this film was like 2009 or something.
On Sunday mornings and just waited until it happened to be nothing happening.
I guess, but I mean, there had to have been some manipulation because you see the Golden Gate Bridge slightly kind of maybe decaying, and different things seeming kind of dingy. So I mean, they probably did some post processing, but we're talking
they
about
took a photo and then did some photoshopping.
Probably. I mean, yeah, it's pretty low budget.
Oh man, I think low budget is probably a stretch.
Zero budget.
I think there's probably no budget. But assuming they made it on a credit card or something, it was. I mean, one, they set out to make a film, and to make a fiction film, they made a really clever choice in terms of shooting it the way they did, because it explains all the low budget
Mm-hmm.
presentation.
Right, right, right.
And it looks like they shot it on a. What was it? What, was it 2001? Or when was the film shot?
Good
It's okay,
question.
but they shot it on a very, looked like a very pretty basic camera.
Yeah,
Um,
I think it was 2000. Um, with like some battery that had been forged by the engineer dude, right? 2001, you're right.
okay.
Yeah.
Um,
So really like low key on the any kind of effects and stuff.
yeah, but I thought and as a kind of technical, as a project scene technically, I thought they did a wonderful job making do with nothing. You know, with a city or the whole city as their backdrop that they didn't pay a cent for.
Right.
You know,
Well, and like the whole North Bay and
yeah,
just across the bridge and you didn't need anything. You just needed your people who are willing to act for you, quote unquote act,
yeah.
right?
Well, and even that, the actors, I mean, probably three-quarters of them did a really good job. The women in the house, um, especially the little sub thing about the pregnancy,
Uh,
they were not great actors. You know, but again, they were shooting this film and got so many good performances out of these people, and
mhm.
very natural. I mean, it's a big credit to no budget filmmaking. Um, so I mean, very high points for that. And then, yeah, again, I think it's worth watching for that emotional tone, if nothing else, being that place of um, kind of transition out of trauma, but still feeling it so much as a like a layer of dust on everything. It's not choking to people, the sadness and the loss. It's not poisoning people, but you can feel it coating everything.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I thought I recognized the engineer, the dude who is like kind of like, oh yeah, we're gonna, you know, like we can do this and this, the kind of ginger in the
Yeah.
basement. Hey, Adam Savage.
No.
He's one of the Mythbusters.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I was like, I know, I recognize that dude, but I don't like, yeah. So, um, well, I think it kind of works too because then people seem more natural describing their experience and kind of what happened and
Well, ideally, but again, the women in the house were not natural.
I didn't think they
That
were
was the
too,
weakest part of the film, I think.
I didn't think they were too bad. Marty. I know, I'm kind, maybe too kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
One issue I do take with this um, is the fucking regressive idea that going backwards is better. Right? Like, so
Well, you
there,
had different opinions in this film, though, on that.
yeah. But there was kind of there was more often than not, there was sort of this idea that the world we had before all this went down was busy and noisy and bad in some way, basically. Like the teenagers saying, like, man, that was bullshit. Like, you know, um, and the various folks who left for kind of these more loose communities or to go live out in the woods by themselves for years on end, which I don't think that guy would have been put together as well as he
Plus, why
was
was he so
presented.
well shaven?
Maybe he just didn't grow hair. I don't know. But very good question. Um, yeah, I mean, you and I have waxed eloquent often about that kind of
I
quality
fa-
of like,
yeah, I found myself about to pounce watching the film and that stuff, but there you had the engineer guy who was presenting a pretty sane, technologically based argument for why there had to be a regression, technological regression.
And he did say for a while, I did
Right.
note that he did say that, like, we're going to have to kind of drop back to this sort of more advanced agrarian
Well,
society.
his argument was technological and rational rather than, um, yeah, hand wavy. Right. Although it still wasn't very strong throughout. It's not like, even the guy out in the woods with the rattlesnake rattles on
Totems.
his hat and so forth, little totems,
Right.
yeah, was not presented as the paragon, nor was the guy on the bike who got killed. Um, I mean, he was not presented as the healthiest character in the film. I mean, the healthiest character is really the engineer and the filmmakers.
And the the women's house, even if they weren't the best of actors, that there was this intentional community that was trying to kind of rise up and, you know, hippy
Yeah,
dippy, but
seemed like a little too much estrogen though.
deal with it.
Just saying. And the woman running the house. I mean, I don't think this is actually part of the film per se, but there was kind of creepy undertones to her, as
How
well as
so?
her. Huh?
How so?
Well, there's like when she's saying, let's give praise to the guy, to whoever went out and shot Mark
Right.
and murdered him in some quarry. That's a little weird, and just her sort of matriarchal. Uh, I didn't feel totally comfortable with her.
No.
No, I would have worried if maybe there's something poison like shows up in the food when you come over for dinner. Probably not, but
That maybe the food is prior guests.
yeah, she had a little bit of that vibe. That
Oh, so
that sort of
cannibals
friendly
did survive
cannibal.
after
Yeah.
all.
Okay, so that's another thing, right? All these post-apocalyptic tropes, they more or less avoided
Hmm.
the cannibals, the Mad Max, violent primitives.
Right.
There was little hints, like when the guy's talking about going into the Central Valley or when Mark is talking about going to Yosemite.
That
But
was a
even that, huh?
loops that there were, as he put it, freaks out there and bands of freaks. Yeah.
Freaks and bands of aggressive, scared people,
Yeah.
right? But to hold a psychological frame like that, even if that was just a little comment of his, it implies something that's quite different than most apocalypse films, where there's this, where there's assumption that people go savage at the drop of a hat, and lose all of their adult training, all of their training in a civilized mind, as if the mind is so primed
To go
to
splat.
go splat, yeah,
Yeah.
or to it's just barely propped up, and if the props are even tweaked, it'll fall back into this more stable, regressed position.
Yeah.
It's like that doesn't make any human sense. That was another thing this film got right, I think, is it made a human psychological sense. This is only 12 years afterwards, and
Well, and if you think about it, it sounds like maybe because they kept using 10, right? So it sounds like kind of the major shit was going down in 2 years. And so kind of once everything had settled down, it was 10 years. So that's a decade is nothing in the drop of a civilization like that, or in the rebuilding of.
well,
It's a
no,
tiny micro drop.
no, but what I mean is like compared uh, to the traditional, again, like the Postman, that movie, or these post-apocalypse movies. Actually, that's not a good example because there's a little bit more
No,
civility.
I thought Postman was a very sweet movie,
Well, I
but
mean,
it
in
does
terms of its
have kind of
presentation of what
the
happens,
warlords and the, yeah.
yeah, what happens to the human mind when the civilized structures uh, give way. And I thought this film gave a better presentation, even though it was quite recent still, like a decade is quite recent.
Right.
But it didn't, again, it posited a more robust and pro-social human mind than a lot of these films do, which just sort of relish in tearing down the internal structures that they apparently assume are totally dependent on the cultural and social structures, Like when those give way, the internal structures of a mind also are assumed to give way. Seems like a really bogus notion of
Right.
the human mind.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And so you see here people who are still coherent. I mean, presumably that's partially because the ones who fell apart killed each other, died off, or suicided. But they weren't even
Well,
really in
they even
implication.
suggested that a lot of people probably did suicide. They couldn't take it. Like,
Right.
some of the interviewees even mentioned their own depression and almost, suiciding and disappearing into drugs or whatever.
Right.
But that they still came around. And even like the museum guy who's trying to build a museum in the midst of and they're just like, no, we're not going to do it. Or Mark himself, who was setting fires to things, people shooting at people out in the woods, the guy who chases them off when they try to go into the backyard with the hammer, right? That they're, to me, it seemed like they were just kind of presented as any kind of broken
Yeah.
person, not that you have these ravening hordes of broken people, but that some people are going to break under that.
Yeah.
In
But they
fact, a
still.
lot of people are probably going to break, but in ways that, again, not like I'm going to go eat someone, but
Well, it's Ken Wilber would talk about how um, prior to the development of a certain prior to the emergence of a certain developmental level, the fundamentalist level that comes out of basically the ego-centered warlord level, the postmodern that comes out of the rationalist level, etc. That these levels become stabilized as mental structures, and until they're stabilized, I mean, until they emerge, they don't exist. And so what you have, the center of gravity is, for instance, fundamentalism during the medieval period, or postmodernism emerging from the 60s. But once those are there in the mind, the idea that they just collapse back to the most base
I,
level
I know, right?
is
I
a
mean, some people,
strange
again,
misreading,
yes,
you know?
but a society as a whole that has evolved and developed in the ways that we have,
Well,
yeah,
not only society as a whole, but the individuals who have been produced in the sort of mental and
right, right.
socioeconomic but mental environment of that society, as if those are different people, those are different minds than what existed in the agrarian or the sort of warlord cultures.
Mm. So why do you think that a broad bulk of our, well, one, that we have so many apocalypse? I mean, I have my theories around zombies, and I imagine some of that might apply as well. Um, but why do we, one, have so many apocalypse movies? And trust me, there's a ton of them out there. But also the fact that there's such collapse,
Yeah.
right? So it like I said, you very rarely um, see movies that have this kind of quality to them. Again, you got to see Goodbye World. I think it's a good one because again, they're just like you can almost count them on like one hand. Like we just have this idea that, well, I guess that's the fear, right? The fear of like collapse of contact and collapse of identity and collapse of belonging, kind of in a way, Maslow's hierarchy. It's like collapse of safety and your basic safety, then collapse of belonging, collapse of sort of self-identity, which I think zombies are, which lead also to belonging and collapse of civilization. But sort of apocalypse in general, I think is a way that we're trying to work out like, okay, what if all that we have come to this point, 13 billion years of evolution, here we are sitting on Skype reviewing a movie that we watched on a TV, that we got through Netflix and through the internets and etc. Um, I think I think like zombie movies are for working out our kind of fear of sort of ego collapse or self-identity and connection to others. I think Apocalypse is about how our fear of collapse of connection to the we, right? Zombies to me feel more like a collapse of the I.
Mm.
But I feel like apocalypse, which zombies are part of, but that's more of a collapse of the we space, right? So suddenly we're all ravening cannibals and eating each other, or shooting each other, or, like in some way, get out of my house. And, that we're not, that, yeah. So that's my theory is that apocalypse movies in general are um, dealing with the lower left quadrant, which would be a Ken
Well,
Wilber
that's
thing.
interesting because it's like, and then you can talk about which level of a we is being worked with in terms of the fear of loss of which
Mm.
level. So, for instance, what comes to mind is like you think of the Mad Max films, the later ones, not the first one, which is a different tone.
Uh,
Um, and what you've got is basically warlord culture, in which individuals are their agendas are to, maximize their own gain and minimize the gains of the others, and the society in quotes that exists is one that exists in a warlord culture in which there's a strong man, um, or a woman, I guess, with Tina Turner, um, who organizes society via strength and punishments and rewards. Um, but you also have something like The Road, right, which was out a couple years ago, which is not about that so much as it's about the collapse of meaning, of social meaning. You have an environment. I mean, you have a little bit of that warlordy stuff in the cannibal tribe, but it's much more. It's about this collapse in in the framework of meaning that makes both social bonds and surviving the void places in life doable. So those are very different
mm.
presentations of the collapse of we.
Yeah, and I've seen all versions of it, that again, most of it is usually pretty violent, collapsy, regressionist, I would say. But I've seen all different brands of it, like how we approach the apocalypse, the road, these kind of Book of Eli kind of quality where it's just more maybe congregations of communities, but kind of really super lonely and kind of something about this movie sort of reminded me of the second season of The Walking Dead. Right, the
Yeah.
best season of The Walking Dead that ever was produced, minus a few episodes here and there. But that sense of like, here's the collapse of society, and you're seeing it in action. That because this is not 10 years later, this is like a few months afterwards that it's happening, um, and that's a very different, like they're having to deal with people who are sort of pulling together as kind of warlordy types kind of more in later seasons, but in that season they're really kind of dealing with survival of their group, and so that's a very different, like you kind of see them sort of together, right? And that's very different from The Road, which is very different from The Postman or Mad Max or any of the various movies of nonsense out there.
Well, I don't think they're nonsense. I think they're just presenting
No,
in
I mean the
different.
really bad ones that I
Oh,
watched.
those.
Yeah. But no, but yeah, I think it's not just voyeurism that we like to watch apocalypse movies and why there are so many out there and so many bad ones out there. Yeah, I don't think it's just because we just like to see zombies eating people, or people dying from the plague or warlords running around. I think we're trying to work out that particular thing that I was talking about, of whatever brand or flavor that you're talking about, like this sort of the Rhodes style or Mad Max style. You know,
Well,
that's what.
there's the basic principle in these movies. I don't know if you can say all movies, but apocalypse movies, destruction movies, horror movies, um, is is surfacing our unconscious fears in making them objects. It almost doesn't, in a way, it almost doesn't matter how they're objectified, because the process of objectification of our fears itself at least is an attempt at a kind of processing and
Mm,
a kind of framing that allows us to hold it within our awareness rather than it sort of consuming our awareness.
right. Like, I mean, I remember growing up and sort of the horror of the day was the slasher, the teen
Hmm.
slasher movies, Jason, Freddy, and all those kind of things. And they've become, because I watch a lot of horror movies kind of in the mix of these ones that are, and sometimes much better than that. But that quality of like things have really changed in terms of like how we get scared now, right? And I think that's partly because we've evolved and we've become more complex. And
Are there
um,
not slasher movies anymore?
I mean, yes, but they're not like I remember watching like Teenage Slumber Party Massacre or something at a slumber party, of course. Um, and it was just straight up like, girls in their little panties running around screaming and getting cut up. Lots of blood, right? And now, yes, you might have people being slashed, but there's a lot more psychological sort of underpinnings. Like the story of the hack and slash has become way more complex than I'm just running around chasing and this kind of,
Well,
like,
what's a modern example of that?
oh boy.
Like where my mind goes is Cabin in the Woods, which is
Well,
not
okay.
the same thing. It's not trying to process traumatic unconscious fears.
No, but okay, we're talking about a Joss Whedon movie that is
No, no, no,
much
no. But the,
more
no, no,
specific.
no. But it's an exemplar. It's maybe a further. It's more maybe a more distilled version. But if you're talking about the advancement of complexity in the framing and the processing of these unconscious fears, that one has so many meta levels to it.
Well, yeah, like the gods being released and destroying the world,
Yeah, well, I think that's an end.
you
He
know.
always needs to destroy
I
something,
know. Yeah.
but more so the levels um, of complexity and the levels of um, control, meaning, structures of control. I mean, maybe it's not a good example, but it does seem to be. It is in the horror genre, sort of.
Okay, so I'll kind of I'll change what I was saying a little bit. So I guess the kind of this what I watch might be called more, I mean, they're horror movies, but they might be called more like thriller horror, like suspenseful. There's a quality in which it is has psychological aspects because we still do have things like Saw. Remember the Saw
Right.
series? Except for I think that's kind of dying out too. Like,
After what, six of them or something?
no, I think it's like 10.
Oh.
I don't even know. It's like been an intense amount of them. Um,
Yeah, but they're almost notable by their relative infrequency. Like the other one, what, Hostel?
well, no, it's like
Uh,
I think it was one every year, right?
no,
And
no,
like kind
but
of
in
around.
terms of the volume of films produced. I mean, maybe there's lots
Yeah,
of
no, I
shitty independent ones, but
yeah. No, but I think it's getting less and less, and I think it's getting more tricksy in the terms of like how do we scare people because that's not as scary, right? And how do we scare people? But I think it also becomes how do we process fears that might be becoming more complex. Remember we
yeah.
were talking about the Bond films wouldn't have made it if they didn't adapt to kind of what was going on, and so our current Bond got darker and more violent
And
and
more internal and psychological.
right. And I don't think the Bond series would have survived if we hadn't have done that. And I don't think that
Believe me, if it hadn't come to this, they should have burned it in a pit, having watched all fucking
uh,
25 of them with James. Oh my god.
right.
Oh my god! Anyone who has nostalgia for the pre modern film world, go back and watch all of those, and then come to
See how
me
you feel about
puking,
it.
and I'll laugh in your face. They were so fucking
You have
horrible.
strong feelings
They were
about.
so horrible. Oh my god. Oh my god. James and I will have to do a review of those sometime, or of our experience watching 25 of those films.
Well, but you like the last couple
Right,
because
20. So
again,
22, I think was
yeah.
the
Because again, but I think that's exactly the same with
yeah.
kind of. I wasn't a big horror watcher when I was younger, but you kind of saw the trailers, Chucky, the stupid doll, and the.
Well, maybe there's a
These
process too where the very vault will remove through developmental stages in terms of, I mean, maybe that the process of objecting those sort of primitive fears, the doll that eats you, you thought he was your friend, but no, he's your, those are pretty
pri-
young fears.
primitive, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
maybe there's something cultural that happens when those are processed over and over through strata, meaning at a certain time in at a certain time, a certain year, strata of these same sort of films. Maybe they're objectified in a way that the actual object of the fear actually gets processed to a certain
No,
degree.
but I think that's what I mean. Like, I think they have changed is because we don't react to them as much anymore, is because one, we've been changing as individuals and as a society, but two, because maybe we have worked those things out in certain ways. I mean, I don't think I would be all, oh yeah, I'm all equanimous with seeing a body that's been chopped up by a machete. You know what I mean? But I think on kind of a broader cultural mindset, that's not as it doesn't hold as much as it used to. And I think partly that's because we have media and we do things with media in order to work through stuff, be it unconsciously or whatever. And a lot of those movies might be shit, but you know me, I'm super nice about movies is because I recognize that they're like I'll see certain elements in a story, even if it's like a 1 star, and even if I give it a 1 star, which is pretty damn bad, um, I still recognize that there's something trying to happen there, right? And it's there might be some that like that the movie I watched with the jail bait, right? Where it's just like, oh my god, this is totally gratuitous, and yet here's this thing about music and freedom and freedom of self. Okay, right. I'll upgrade you to two
You strike
stars.
me as like your relationship to movies is like you'd be looking at one of those, the ugliest dog in the world, the Chinese Ridgeback or whatever it's
Yeah,
called,
yeah,
and you'd be
yeah.
like, well, he's not totally bald.
Yeah, because I recognize that our psyches are channeled through art.
Of course.
Yeah, and movies I think are especially vivid because you can present these moving images that we already have going on in our heads, or at least some of us do. That there is cinematic quality. It's like seeing your imagination alive, right? And so no wonder that books get turned into movies, and it's like because we get to see it, we get to see it on screen. It might not look exactly how like when I'm reading The Hunger Games, how I might imagine Katniss, or if I'm reading, whatever I'm reading, I might be imagining something completely different. But I think movies are probably the most evocative of psychological processes of art. Like if you think of art, I think film has the most potent potential
Potential for what?
for offering that the processing that you're talking about, the sort of
More than
psychological
music or
portals.
visual art?
I would have said yes to that probably maybe 10 years ago. But I think sort of the advancements of technology and digital processing, and now we can, whatever we can imagine, we can show. Be that, like, God, what was it like? I don't know, 6 months ago, half a year ago, I went and rewatched all the Hellraiser series. I was like, oh my God, this is like, one, they were super bad, even though when I initially watched them, of course, they had a lot of potency, but now they don't. But I can imagine if they had been a little more cleaner in terms of like, or more real, like I could tell that the things were puppets or makeup or whatever, then that might have had a different kind of quality to it. Like certain movies that sometimes you can't tell the difference between the CG and that things start to blur, like the Transformer movies, where it was just like, holy shit, this is a whole new level of this. Almost, this feels real. And so, and just imagine having kind of these sort of ravening psychological imagery on screen that you can see. Anything that we can think of now, we can put on screen. And I don't think we can do that so much with
It's still,
live art.
I find interesting. It's maybe a bit parenthetical, but or footnotey, but the amazing capacity of current, like you say, digital technology to present whatever can be imagined, is doing this funny thing where one, it's training us to not really look at the CG. In other words, we're expecting such high quality that the idea of it not being high quality, that's just seen as kind of amateurish, and
Right?
so it's
Like,
forcing
did they
the
choose that, or
right,
was that a mistake,
but it's
right?
forcing the attention back to the storytelling, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
we're like, yeah, well, of
Eh,
course it's going to be perfect because
right. We're done with the
the
gee whiz. Now
yeah
give us the. I mean, and I think you and I have always made the argument about games. Like, games have reached, okay, we're done
yeah
with the gee whiz. Give us the story. And I
yeah,
think
you can see
that's,
that in The Last of Us. Like
yes,
that's I think that in the history of video games, that's going to mark a transition to a whole another level of sophistication.
I hope so.
No, it has to, because I mean, like we've been seeing this glass ceiling that's existed where you have, I mean, essentially engineer types running the show instead of artists and storytellers,
Hmm.
and it's just flat. I mean, you look at like the whole first person shooter genre. I mean, the big AAA games,
Call of Duty
Call
or
of Duty,
whatever. Yeah.
Black, and all that stuff.
Right, right.
They've topped out.
Oh,
They've
yeah.
and even but technologically they become so there's not much room to go storytelling wise. They're being run by, so in other words, the capacity for the technology to present then makes it even more stark when the minds that are presenting are not very sophisticated. In Last of Us, the technology was the forefront
Incredible.
of what existed whatever 2 years ago or something.
Right, right.
Um, but the
Try to think
minds that were
now.
presenting it were, in the scheme of things, fairly sophisticated, and the nuance of emotions and internal life of these characters was a leap beyond most games especially recent games. It doesn't say anything negative about these other genres. It's just like in terms of the forward motion. So it seems like here, like with the James Bond films, like you were saying, the focus on internality, is that a word? Internal
Is now.
life, psychology is it's almost becoming sort of atavistic to not present more complexly internal characters. Um, even in the Bondian sort of thriller, you got like the Jason Bourne movies,
Hmm.
um, and they're a whole different game than those old 007s. The old James Bond films prior to Craig have no internal lives. Maybe a little hint here and there. There was one, I forget what film, midway through, that had a somewhat psychology. Otherwise, they're apsychological. And I don't.
You're going to be scarred for life for that
Yeah.
experience.
Well, it's just
You're
such a great example of a transition over time
right.
in terms of
Yeah.
sophistication.
Yeah.
But it was so marked between the pre-Craig films and the Craig films, um, and also the Bond films. I'm sorry, the Bourne films
Born.
compared to the
Yeah.
Bond films. Um, and thrillers after that have really become much more psychological in their orientation. So it seems like this emergence of in popular culture of the mind, the internal life, presented through the most sort of regurgitated archetypes, like the Bond character, is pretty remarkable. And I think
Mm.
this film, in its genre, it doesn't, it's a sophomore, or it's a B effort, I think, but still remarkable for its no budget. But it presents in that genre, minds, psychologies, social psychologies, and also a more sophisticated, like we were saying, a more sophisticated version of a mind of minds which have internal cohesion, rather than strict dependency on their environment, and therefore when the environment fails, they fail.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that seems
Right.
much more true. Um, so maybe the larger class of apocalypse films are really talking about this fear that exists, that our minds are actually much more dependent on external conditions than we would like to admit. That
Mm-hmm.
we have much less cohesion, coherency, and autonomy than, which is the dogma of modern culture and modern, so post Enlightenment culture, that we are individuals, we're autonomous, and yet if not only things but minds can break apart so easily with the collapse of their environments, that's a pretty scary thing for the modern mind. It might not be for a medieval mind; it might be just axiomatic, that would happen. Well, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
your village falls apart. Of course, you fall apart.
Right.
But for us, our minds trying to stabilize in autonomy and in interdependence. Uh, Maybe that's one of the things we're trying to work out through these films, is
Mm-hmm.
how much actual mental autonomy and internal autonomy do we have?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, well, that I would say is the same thing as the cohesion of the ego in terms of zombie movies, like that we could so easily turn into a primal sort of
right,
creature.
from
Yeah.
nothing more than a bite, and some
Right?
or
You
some
know,
films like a drop of blood, or
a scratch or something. Yeah.
a scratch or something, like
Yeah.
we have
Or a
that
meteor
so.
lands. Well,
Hmm?
those are pretty old. I said that
Or
those,
meteor lands, yeah.
yeah, I mean, those are actually pretty old. And,
But
we
that's an
can
interesting
talk
point. I hadn't
about,
thought about that. Like literally, the barrier of the skin is what prevents you from totally degrading in terms of your ego structure,
hmm.
right? The
Well, that's
skin
kind of the
layers,
same thing, right? Like I have a structure of society. If that's gone, bam, I go,
right?
right? I have this structure of this body and this protection of this skin. And if that goes, I go, right?
Right.
Never, yeah, kind of interesting.
Right. So this deep fear of vulnerability, and
Hmm.
then our structures of defense or separation, right? Like the skin separates. That those are actually, lies, because these films constantly present the winners, not maybe the long term winners, but the immediate winners as the most brutal, right? Not the most pro social.
Oh, the warlords. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And in the zombie films, the force is the winning force often is just the overwhelming power of degraded life, like just in terms of sheer numbers and volume. That the complexity and the nuancedness of the modern mind gets thoroughly overwhelmed by this, not even pre-modern,
Hmm.
this just degraded physical process.
Yeah. I feel like I need to,
So what we're reviewing here?
ever since the world ended.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah. Which is
So
all about that too.
we got to give it our thumbs. We're gonna give it thumbs up. I'm gonna give it, well, one thumb up and one semi-erect thumb.
I'll give it two thumbs up.
Yeah.
I still think it held after the second meeting.
All right. All right. So
Two
we have a
thumbs
bit
up.
of difference of opinion there.
Err.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I guess we did another episode of Movie Talk. Yeah. Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now what?
That's it. We're done. Whee! Okay. Goodbye, viewer.
Yeah.
Waiting for the help.
God damn it. Yeah, okay, shut up. No. Oh, wrong keyboard.
Bored now.
I'm having a hot flash.
You never clean the crap off your computers. You leave too much shit running at the same time.
Wait, what? Marty Cooper.